this is Angela with Parker's Permaculture. Now, I've made a series of videos lately where I am using the fact that a meme of my garden went viral as a learning opportunity, as an opportunity to design for solutions. And I want to do a little bit more of that here again today. I've gotten a number of comments of like, oh, just ignore the haters and ignore the trolls and like, just don't listen to that stuff and don't even respond to it. And I really appreciate that. I appreciate all of you folks who are saying like you need to protect your emotional well-being and you need to, make sure that you're not exposing yourself to things that are, harmful in the long term. And I thank you. I appreciate you looking out for me. But I want to make it really clear. I see those kinds of interactions with folks making really bold and really wrong assumptions about my garden, even folks throwing out insults. I see that as an opportunity to use the permaculture concept of the problem is the solution. How do we take something that is inherently a negative, that is a problem? How do we reframe it in a way that helps us push towards solutions, that helps us design a better world, a better garden, a better way of relating to each other? So for me, when I read through these comments, and I have read thousands and thousands of them, I'm trying to, process the level at which they are upsetting, but more than that, I'm trying to say, what is the teaching opportunity here? Either for myself, how can I either take this kind of interaction and use it as something that I can harness going forward in order to design better in my garden, or maybe it's a valid critique and I can use it as something where I need to check myself and humble myself. But also I see it as a teaching opportunity, because when folks make incorrect assumptions about what's happening in my garden, what I'm hearing when I see that, what I'm reading when I see that, is that there is the potential there to correct them. And I don't mean that in a way that is meant to be harmful to them. If they're ignorant about what's happening here, and I use ignorant as a very neutral word, ignorant just meaning lacking the knowledge, lacking the know-how, lacking in understanding. And let's be real, permaculture is kind of niche. And so, I would assume that folks don't necessarily know what permaculture is or know what I'm doing, and they are applying their very modern agrochemical industrial way of gardening or farming. They're applying that worldview and that framework to my garden, and therefore it doesn't make sense. So when I see these kinds of comments, I think this is an opportunity for education. This is an opportunity to help explain what is happening in my garden. So I'm going to do that here today once again, and I hope that it is helpful. We'll see. I might break it into 2 videos. It depends on how long I'm running here. So when folks say that is really irresponsible of her to put this forth as a one-size-fits-all solution, as a way that everybody should garden, I've been really, really clear from the beginning of this channel that permaculture is site-specific design. In fact, if you're a subscriber and you watch most of my videos, you are probably sick to death of me saying permaculture is site-specific design. It is not a one-size-fits-all solution. When you see a picture of my garden that somebody else turned into a meme, I am in no way preaching you should do that to your garden. Your garden should look like mine. In fact, most people in most places should not have a garden that looks like mine. Permaculture is a design system where we take the 12 principles of permaculture and the 3 ethics, and we apply them to our specific location, to our specific climate, to the specific variances of our actual patch of land. We apply them to the specific needs of us, the gardener, and the specific cultural and social realities of the community that we live in. Therefore, it could never be a one-size-fits-all. There is not one biome on planet Earth. There are myriad, because the conditions shift from location to location. Permaculture is using strategies that we glean from the way that ecosystems function in nature and applying those to our specific gardens. Of course, somebody in fire-prone California is not going to have a garden that looks like mine. I live in the middle of the city in Portland, Oregon. Fire is not a significant risk here. Now, if I lived outside the city, perhaps south of Portland, where fires are more of an issue, if I lived in a rural area, I would design with fire breaks. I would design differently because I am assessing the needs of my site, the risks. I'm assessing the conditions of my site, and I'm assessing how well I am able to respond to adverse events on my site. But in the middle of the city, in a climate where it rains 9 months out of the year, my design is appropriate. It's not something that could work if you lived somewhere that was much more arid. In fact, I'm going to do a whole video on him later, but I am a huge fan of Brad Lancaster in Tucson, Arizona. As somebody who lived in Tucson when I was a kid, I am a little bit obsessed with like high desert, low desert, arid permaculture. Anything to do with dry land permaculture fascinates me, particularly though the work of Brad in the Sonoran Desert. So check out his video and I'll have a whole video on him coming up, because if you don't know about him, you really should. So if you lived somewhere that was much more arid than where I am, you would design differently. In fact, this is where I want to give a shout out to 2 permaculture YouTube channels that I have been watching quite a bit lately.
While we're still in the same state, Green Lady Permaculture is in a very different climate than I am, and she also focuses on raising meat rabbits. Nax Permaculture is over in Idaho, and he has a very different looking project than mine, still following permaculture design principles.
Both in the Northwest like me, but in very different locations. I will link to their YouTubes down below. And so when I'm looking at their permaculture design, it's very different than mine. I'm learning a lot about what it's like to design somewhere that perhaps is more difficult and has to deal with different things. I mean, I have to deal a lot with mud, water, like I have a whole blog post about how we had to deal with the issue of water in our basement, how my garden fixed that. You should definitely go read that if you get a chance. But for me, water, how water moves through my property, how it stays on my property, mud are big issues for me. For someone in a dry climate, they would design differently. They wouldn't have to deal with navigating those issues, right? Permaculture looks different depending on where you live, what your needs are, what your culture is, what the conditions of your site are. I don't know how much more I could say that. I have never, ever advocated for a one-size-fits-all approach. I hope that there are tidbits that you can glean from this channel that are helpful and that you can apply to your design. It may look very different in application because your site is different. Your energy, your budget, your time commitment may look very different than mine. The realities of your life may be very different than mine. And so everyone's permaculture is going to look a little bit different. One of the things I hope you can gain from this channel, it's not my poodle's barking. So quickly here, let's take a couple of other examples before we wrap up. Permaculture principle, obtain a yield. How would that look different in different locations? Well, here in the Pacific Northwest, I have a huge yield of temperate fruit crops, where I have a long growing season that's not particularly hot. This is the best place to grow berries. So berries are a significant part of my yield. Mulberries, blackberries, raspberries, blueberries, June berries, Saskatoons, gummy berries, aronia berries, kiwi berries, elderberries, all of those things I grow here. If you did tropical permaculture, your yield would be very different. You would have mangoes and papayas and citrus and ice cream bean and all of those things I long to grow for but cannot in my climate, right? If you did arid permaculture in the desert, your yield might be things like tunas. It might be things like mesquite beans. It might be things like nopalitos. Your yield would look very different because it would be a yield that is successful, abundant, sustainably produced in your climate. Americans have, Western folks in general, have this notion of we should have access to any food that we want and we should shoehorn in crops that don't necessarily grow very well in our climates, and then we have a right to eat all of those foods that are in the grocery store. Permaculture says we actually want to tailor our diet to our climate. We actually want to, oh, I have a dog visiting. Hi, buddy, come here. We actually want to tailor our diets to what is sustainable to grow in our climate, right? And that's because permaculture is looking for that local food production. It's looking for a resilient way of growing food that is hyper-local, that is achievable, that is successful in our climates. So that means when we let go of the expectation that we are all eating the same kinds of foods everywhere around the world at all seasons of the year, and we start to think about eating locally, seasonally, culturally appropriately, and climate appropriately, it's very easy to see how our permaculture design would be different depending on where we live. Another example would be the permaculture principle of design from patterns to details, where we look at the big picture and we zone in on those details and we zone out. The details of each landscape are going to be very different depending on where we live. And those details, those nuances that we can use to tweak our system those patterns that we can look for are going to be different depending on where we are. There is no permaculture principle that is not applicable to whatever site you're at. It's just that the outcome and the design that is generated by following those principles is going to look very different depending on where you are. So I hope that clears up that point. I hope that that is helpful for folks. When you look at permaculture, when you look in my garden, you can confidently say, I can have a very productive permaculture system, a very resilient permaculture system, and it does not need to look like Angela's garden. In fact, maybe it shouldn't look like her garden. And not all gardens should look the same. We should stop expecting homogeneity of our gardens. And when we do that, homogeneity of our gardens, homogeneity of our diet, homogeneity of the way that we think about growing food, when we can cast those aside and start to embrace the diversity that comes out of using the 12 principles of permaculture design, we can create a more resilient world. We can create more resilient and productive gardens. Please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and be sure and check out my Patreon down below, and I'll be back from outdoors in my permaculture garden next time.